Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is George Sfinis. I'm an engagement manager at Standards Australia in the ICT sector, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to Standards Australia's World Standards Day event this year. The event promises to be an incredibly important conversation on the importance of standards in technology. We are at Standards Australia's offices here in Sydney this morning, so I'd like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians on the lands on which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and we pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Now, every year, World Standards Day allows us to celebrate standards both nationally and internationally. The theme of World Standards Day this year is incorporating Sustainable Development Goal 3 in standards development, ensuring healthy lives and promoting well-being for all at all ages. So to formally open the event, I'd like to call on Adam Stingemore, General Manager, Engagement and Communications at Standards Australia, for a brief introduction. Thank you.
Thank you, George, and good morning, everyone here in Bridge Street, Sydney, and to all of you joining us online this morning. You are very welcome. We're one of the first organisations this year to celebrate World Standards Day. Being where we are in the world, it's really important that we set the tone of the World Standards Day celebrations for all of our colleagues from the 168 other members of the International Standards Organisation, of which we're Australia's member. And this year's theme, A Shared Vision for a Better World, resonates with me with the work that we do here at Standards Australia. It resonates with the challenges that we see in the world between member states with the rise in technology and the climate. And so we're here this morning to have a conversation about how all of these things are coming together, but with a focus on four elements. Technology sits in all of them, but this is not a technology conversation. We're going to be speaking this morning about artificial intelligence. We're going to be speaking about digital health. We're going to be speaking about how in each home in Australia we're bringing devices in that have the potential for so much good if managed well, but have potential for harm if not. And we're going to be talking about the security risks that sit across a number of these things. George will be facilitating a wonderful discussion this morning with Lyria, Richard, Frank and Soraya, who will introduce themselves. You are all very welcome here in Sydney today and online. And to everyone, happy World Standards Day. Thank you, George.
Thank you for that. Thank you for those words, Adam. Now, moving to the logistics for this morning's event. First up, we'll have the four presentations followed by a panel session. There will be some time at the end for a Q&A, and there will be a QR code that will direct you to the Slido. We will be using Slido for the Q&A today. For those online, there will be a link that takes you to the Slido. There should be a link that appears. And for those in the room, we will be doing an old-fashioned Q&A where we raise our hands and take questions the old-school way, ironically. But importantly, today's lineup. So firstly, Soraya Selinger. Soraya is a Strategic Initiatives Manager at Standards Australia, actively working in the critical and emerging technology space. Previously, Soraya has worked as a multidisciplinary music and media executive with a focus on management, strategy and business development. Soraya was also the winner of the 2019 Women of the Future Awards. Thank you, Soraya. Lyria Bennett-Moses. Lyria is the Director of the UNSW Allens Hub for Technology, Law and Innovation and a Professor and Associate Dean in the Faculty of Law at UNSW Sydney. Lyria is also the co-lead of the Law and Policy theme in the Cybersecurity CRC and also a member of Standards Australia's Committee for Artificial Intelligence. Welcome, Lyria. Richard Dixon-Hughes. Richard is the Managing Director of DH4 and is the current Chair of Standards Australia's Technical Committee for Health Informatics, as well as Standards Australia's Head of Delegation to the International Committee for Health Informatics. Richard has a particular focus on the organisation and the effective application of technology in government, health and the not-for-profit sector. Thank you, Richard. Last but not least, Frank Zeichner. Frank is a thought leader in the adoption of Internet of Things. Frank is the founding CEO of the Internet of Things Alliance Australia, the peak body that drives collaboration across industry, research, government and the community to improve Australia's competitiveness and the lives of Australians. Frank is also on the board of the New South Wales Smart Sensing Network. Thank you, Frank. Without further ado, I'd like to invite Soraya Selinger to present.
Thanks, George, and thanks everyone else for being here today, online and in person. There we go. For those who want to learn a little bit more about me, I come from a very different background. As George alluded to, I'm a music and entertainment exec by trade originally. Here on the screen, you'll see a series of short photos from that glittered past. My first #1 record, me in the studio in the background with an act called the Swedish House Mafia, me in a hot air balloon doing the first Radio 1 broadcast live on the BBC. And in all of these things, I had enormous impact. I was able to allow people to facilitate their dreams, but I stood in the shadows. None of these pictures are me on stage. None of these pictures are me in a private jet. None of those experiences are me front and foremost. And weirdly, it's that same experience of having impact which allows me to enjoy and facilitate and do my work here at Standards Australia. So let's take a step even further back. 1869, in the city of Burr in Ireland. Mary Ward is a scientist and writer. She's in a steam-powered carriage and she is driving along the road with 3 of her buddies. She hits a speed bump, she goes flying out the front, the car keeps rolling and it rolls over her and crushes her. She's the first person to die in a car accident. We didn't stop making cars because they were unsafe. We put in place regulation and policy and standards that help keep people safe. And I think if there's anything to take away from the presentation today from me, it's that there is an important aspect of making sure that when we think about new technology, we don't go completely dystopian and we think about how can we adopt technology in a safe and effective way. And actually, today there are 7 standards for road safety. So very quickly, I'm going to talk a little bit about who Standards Australia are, what we do, and hopefully, because you're tuning in for World Standards Day, this can be very brief. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we're doing in critical and emerging technologies, and then I'm going to go into a bit of depth on one standard which is coming up, which is very pertinent for, I guess, the conversation that everyone's feeling right now around AI. So very briefly, Standards Australia is Australia's peak non-government, not-for-profit standards development body. We are completely formed to encourage investment, to build trust, to support the local community, to support government and to support industry. We also sit as part of ISO and IEC representing Australia as one nation. And we, many of our members here today, Lyria, Frank, will be testament to that position. We develop standards publications through formally constituted committees and contributors. We don't make laws, and as Lyria has very kindly pointed out to me, sometimes our work does cross over into regulation, so these slides will be updated after this. It's important to also understand that we develop standards through consensus, and standards are voluntary documents. So it's really about the fact that they're built from a broad range of stakeholders and that harmonious process, which actually allows them to be documents which are really relevant and have a lot of impact, and have impact in a quiet way, similar to how I started this. We have a lot of committee members and we have a lot of nominating organisations, and from our last count, I believe we have just shy of 30,000 standards. So there is a significant amount of work that we put out into the world, and it's all very, very important and very valuable. So in terms of what we do in critical and emerging technology, so I sit in the strategic initiatives team, and we effectively do the non-traditional standards things. So what does that mean? There is an entire process which goes towards creating what a standard is, and there is literally hundreds of people upstairs that facilitate and support and help build that process. We work on the adjacencies to standards, and we not so unusually work in areas where things are moving at a different pace. They're moving a little bit faster or in a way that's a little bit different. So critical and emerging technology is a pretty enormous focus for what we do. In terms of AI specifically, I'll go into that in a bit more depth, but there are lots of other topics in which we cover, which includes the metaverse, quantum, smart cities, all of those above that are listed here. And I would also just use this as a moment to say that these are not all of the things that we do. These are the things we're focused on at the moment, but equally when there are new opportunities for new areas of standards development and new areas for standards work and adjacency work, we definitely explore those. In quantum, we have quite a substantial amount of work underway, and there is a lot of work being published. There is nationally 2 leading experts which are developing a series of white papers, which you can see are coming imminently. Internationally, we also participate in the International Working Group on Quantum. We have podcasts coming out soon, which includes Adam Stingemore, who you heard from earlier as well. And we often host launch events for things like what you see today when we're launching new papers or have new topics which are really relevant to the audience. In terms of smart cities, we've actually been working on smart cities for a few years. So that work started with a roadmap and a consultation piece. And then at some point, they decided that an advisory group was really necessary to be kicked off to look at the more strategic themes which were coming out of that work. So as an action point, the Smart Cities Advisory Group was established, and that has worked very closely with the committees, to make sure that we're developing thematic papers that are strategically important, and that's going to come to a peak at the start of next year with an event and some further papers that are coming out. Now, in terms of AI at the moment is an incredibly hot topic. You would be living under a rock if you hadn't heard of it and hadn't been aware of the impact. But for those who are on the other side of the rock, nearly 70% of organisations worldwide will be employing AI technology by 2030, and these will be paired with other technologies. But when asked if people believe that they had the measures in place to look after those technologies, 24% of organisations said they did. So there is a huge delta between, yes, we need it, how do we do it? Standards can facilitate with that. So this lovely gentleman, Stephen Schwartz, which I'm not expecting anyone here to know him, but if you do, you'll have the heads up on the joke. He was the unfortunate lawyer who had to pay a fine after fictitious legal research was submitted through an aviation injury claim in June this year. He unfortunately used the power of ChatGPT to create that fictitious legal research. And against the 7 cases he filed against Colombian airline Avianca, received a very humiliating slap on the wrist and unfortunately a very unfortunate encounter with Judge Kevin Castell, who said that he didn't do anything inherently proper, but the technology itself needed to be checked humanly. And I think that's a really interesting point because the technology itself doesn't instill trust. Trust comes from people. Trust comes from understanding the system, and standards can help with that piece. Knowing the inputs into the AI and understanding why it exists and what it is doing will build that trust. And it helps build with issues such as data discrimination or a lack of transparency. It helps with just generally disseminating false information. Models can be dangerous because they don't understand what they're saying or why they're saying it, whereas people can help decipher what things are saying and why they're saying it. There's also a lot of fear around AI. There's a lot of fear about what will happen to my job, what will happen to my life, what is going on if I decide to choose that. And actually, AI has a lot to offer in terms of productivity for our lives. AI has a huge amount to offer in terms of removing that fear and using it in a positive way. And I think these things are all part of the same conversation, weaving together trust and productivity. And ultimately, safety. Safety is a prime concern for people. If you think right back to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, trust and safety sit right there on that bottom ledge. They are part of that kind of physiological need layer. You need food, you need water, and then right above that, you need to feel safe. Once you have those things available to you, things get easier. We see that the democratization of AI can help with that. The EU AI Act calls on international standards 27 times. There is a lot that standards can offer that can bring around safety, and because they are those voluntary consensus-built documents, they can do so in a way that's really, really applicable for people and really relatable and don't feel quite as punitive as other measures which can be taken in place. We're definitely seeing areas such as healthcare and finance, infrastructure, government, these areas looking at standards to help with keeping AI safe at the moment. So what does this all mean? Well, I mentioned this a little bit earlier. We have, as I said, lots of standards. We have 20 AI standards with another 30 coming in the pipeline. We have one coming which I believe comes out of the ballot phase in early December now, so it's likely to be released sometime in January, February. And that is an AI management system standard. And we feel like this will be a very valuable piece of work and will have a big impact because it helps with all the things that I've just talked about. It helps with trust, it helps with safety, and it helps with productivity. So what is this about? It's effectively a common high-level structure for how an organisation can govern and regulate its AI. It is it's part of a process that helps organisations certify themselves against the standard. And for those who aren't aware, a management system standard it's almost like a template of a standard, and so it's replicated. So those who have seen previous ones will find all of this very comforting and very easy to digest. It is a horizontal standard as well. So it means that the AI can be attributed to any type of organisation, and it's not it is sector agnostic. It is not sector specific, which means that it applies to virtually every organisation out there that wants to use AI. And as we've seen earlier, the appetite's fairly enormous. It also stresses the need for an organisation to understand itself. What is the context in which this AI is going into? And how important is it that it has the appropriate risk appetite? How important is it that the organisation wants the AI to be used in a certain way? And that context is what effectively frames the standard. Off the back of that, the planning, which is ultimately a piece about the internal policy that the organisation will take, the inputs from the risk, the inputs from that appetite, the inputs from the use case will then inform how does the organisation decide to govern itself. And that piece is really important because it allows the company to establish its own assessment and its own way of self-governing and self-regulating. The third part of the standard, and I've very much brushed over an extensive, lengthy document, so please acknowledge that there is far more to the document than what I'm rushing over. I'm just trying to give you a top-level view, is very much about the leadership and executive aspect. And it's really a key section for executives to understand because it allows people to have confidence in their teams and it allows them to have confidence in the system. It is a process which is about continual review and it's an iterative feedback cycle. So every time the organisation reports or does something within the AI, it allows it to circle back and say, what did we learn? What did we do right? What did we do wrong? And then feedback again. And that is a pretty crucial part of any type of organisational improvement. It also protects against things like system drift, where the world might move away and the AI stands still. So it protects against these things. And it allows fast-moving areas to move quickly in a way that's safe, in a way that they can trust their internal systems. And that's pretty important. Generally, people don't act maliciously. They don't act because they're trying to do something wrong. They're trying to be efficient. And through efficiency, they trip up. And what this does is it puts in place a framework which prohibits that from happening, or at least protects to the best degree possible from those things from happening. We are working on 2 training courses to support this. And part of that is to help people understand how to use it better, but also to have confidence in using it. For clarity, we do not certify and we won't be offering certification, but we will be able to signpost towards places that can help and support in this way. Generally, we are seeing, I guess, cross-culturally, a shift. And we're seeing that shift from regulation and policy from a place where when social media first came out, it was, you guys stay over there, we've got this. We're just going to really move quickly and adopt and create and generate, and policy and regulation and standards can keep up with us, to a position, if any of you have watched the US congressional hearings, it's quite a fascinating bit of viewing. Industry wants regulation, they want standards, they want things that help them guide themselves into the right place. And as the people in the room, as the people that create the standards and develop the standards and help with creating the regulation and building a safe place, it's our responsibility, outside of the engineers who make the tools and the marketing and corporations that wrap it up neatly and sell it to us. It's our responsibility to shape what that environment looks like. So standards are good, standards are impactful, standards offer trust and safety, and they can help with productivity, and they are absolutely a crucial way of supporting in the critical and emerging tech space. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Soraya. I think the parallels between AI and an automobile and the first fatality was quite interesting, but actually quite thought-provoking about how we do approach AI going forward. On AI, on the topic of AI, I'd like to invite Lyria Bennett-Moses to the floor. Thanks, Lyria.
So I'm going to talk a little bit about AI and the role of standards. But to start with, I thought, cast your mind back not that long ago. Artificial intelligence was not the word everyone was using. People use different words for what we are now calling artificial intelligence. But AI as a concept wasn't the popular imagination. In fact, quite a few years ago now, Professor Genevieve Bell gave a talk when she said, whenever she mentions the word artificial intelligence, the first thing most people think about is Terminator. I don't think that's the case anymore. That's quite an old movie now. But artificial intelligence is to some extent now the word we're using to pin not only our fears for the future, Terminator style, but also very much our hopes for the future. And there's a lot of really fantastic stuff happening, really interesting developments. Generative AI, of course, is very much, getting a lot of attention at the moment, as well as meaning I can make much better presentations with cool pictures. Not that I've done that today, but, in theory, that people for whom English is a second language can smooth their expression and make it sound more professional. It can also, of course, cheat on Year 10 history essays. To the sort of massive things we're seeing happen in medicine, with data-driven insights helping not only in improving patient care, but also in the development of new pharmaceuticals and finding promising products, as well as, of course, being an important tool in areas like radiology. So lots of excitement and good reason for optimism. And of course, there's the but, because I did start out with hopes and fears. So there's lots of things people are also worried about. One of those is the problem of unfair bias. And we've heard many examples of this, but just to highlight a couple, the fact that facial recognition and the facial recognition software that was being marketed was shown to be more accurate for lighter skinned people than for darker skinned people. And that obviously creates problems, particularly when these tools are being used by law enforcement to make decisions about things like arrests. Other contexts as well. The one that often gets referenced in my field of law is the Compass tool. I don't even know if that's artificial intelligence or not, because it was commercial in confidence and no one got to see how it actually works. But either way, certainly a data-driven tool that was used to classify people in the criminal justice system based on their risk of reoffending. And in that particular case, it was demonstrated that there was a higher false positive rate for African Americans compared to white Americans, thus an obvious kind of bias. Although I should say, and this is where it gets complicated, and this is where we do need standards, it's never that simple. So the company came back to that allegation and pointed out that based on a different fairness metric, they were perfect. They met that other one. And then since then, I think someone's pointed out there are over 30 different fairness metrics that one can use, from having the same false positive rate to having the same score mean the same thing. And so there's a real confusion out there, what do we do, right? How, what is the responsibility of an organisation releasing a tool like this? What is the test? How do we make that call? What do we test for? What kinds of evaluations should we be doing? And of course, it's not easy. Now, another concern that's come out about artificial intelligence is the issue of accountability. And the real challenge here is, whose decision is it when the decision maker is relying on a primary input into that decision, the output of a system designed possibly by a third-party software vendor, and so forth, right? So how do we ensure that we maintain what are currently human systems for accountability in a context where decision-making looks like it's coming from a variety of different places, some of which are AI systems? Now, to some extent, the sort of early reaction to this was, well, let's have ethics, right? And I'm not against ethics. I do find it fascinating that we have statements of AI ethical principles, but no actual statements of ethical principles for other things. I just think this sort of suggests a kind of narrow tunnel vision focus. I would love ethics everywhere, including in high school education and so forth, and that would be great. But we only seem to have it for AI, and when we do have it for AI, it's often very unhelpful motherhood-like statements. Like, when you use AI systems, you must, do good, make things better for individual society and the environment while you're at it. And of course, no unfair bias, be accountable, be transparent, be fair. It all sounds wonderful. And it's very hard to disagree, right? No, I want AI systems to be unfair. I mean, no. But it's also very hard to operationalise. I've just explained in the context of fairness. You can have something telling you be fair, but what does that mean? What should you actually do as an organisation if you want to meet that? So law is also really important here, but we're not actually doing a very good job with it. So the European Union has a proposal that we don't actually have the final text for yet. There's some tripartite discussion between the Council, the Parliament and the Commission. But either way, their approach seems to be a define and regulate approach, right? The problem is a technology. It's AI. Let's define AI. What is AI? Okay, let's come up with a definition. They all disagree, of course, on what that is. But then let's regulate that thing. And that's really problematic for law to do, because as I've just said, we're just using the word AI as a kind of touchstone for all of our hopes and fears for a whole wide variety of technological practices, if you like. And what were previously often quite different fields are now all within this sort of AI umbrella. So, how do you define what this thing is in a way that everyone can agree with and that makes sense and that won't become technologically obsolete very quickly? And we can see this just in the fact that some of the definitions for AI that predated the sort of generative AI don't fully cover it because they don't use, the content generation as opposed to generating recommendation. So you've got this real challenge in defining a moving target and then regulating in a very technology-specific way for a very rapidly moving technology, some of which can be, used in a whole variety of contexts across industries. I mean, it's pretty much, I think, an impossible task, but we'll see how they go. On the other hand, you've got what I would say is a better approach, which is the idea of actually not regulating the technology per se, but instead asking what are the values we want to protect? How are we trying to protect those values at the moment? And is it working in these new technological contexts? And I think we can see when we look at things like discrimination law, it is not well worded for the way decisions are currently being made. Right? So we need to go back to discrimination law. That's a value we all care about. It's a value we all agree with. I don't think there's many opponents to discrimination law nowadays at the conceptual level. But we need to think about how do we rewrite that law so that it leads to fair decision-making, if I can use that word, in the context where decisions are either being made by AI systems or where AI systems are playing a role. We also need to fix consumer law, privacy law, administrative law. I could go on. And we're not. Right. The Australian Law Reform Commission had a proposal a few years ago now to look at administrative law. This is government decision-making, and said we need to look at, the role of artificial intelligence and automated decision-making systems. And the government said, no, do something else instead. So we're not actually moving on that. And it's a hard task, right? There's a lot of work to do and we haven't really started. So standards. Now, I should say I first discovered, learned about standards from a conversation when the AI standards were a proposal. And I met Aurélie Jacquet in a cafe and, she was basically collecting signatures. It was a bit like, what you have to do to get things on ballots and so forth. And the reason I didn't know about standards is I have a law degree and standards literally did not come up, which is a problem. So World Standards Day, I think one of the missions I am undertaking is to try to ensure that legal education takes the role of standards seriously. But standards are very important. They don't replace law. That point's been excellently made. And there's things that I think we could do better with standards, battles that I will continue to fight. One is for greater transparency around the content of standards and thus funding the development of standards in a different way. And the second is more diverse involvement in setting the standards. In other words, including more people, particularly from the not-for-profit sector, and providing funding to enable that to happen. So I'll keep fighting for those. But in the meantime, we do have an excellent and long-standing system of standards creation. And what standards do in the context of AI, I won't go through the detail because we've had that, is that for organisations that either want to do the right thing or that need to do the right thing, either because of legal requirements or because of consumer demand or simply their role in the supply chain means that other organisations are asking them to do it, have somewhere to go that says more than do good, please, right? It tells them, for example, in the new management system standard, what are the kinds of things that policies need to address, right? What are the kinds of, resourcing, human and otherwise that we need to put in to be able to do this well and so forth. And I won't repeat what's already been said. But what's important in this, when I first joined standards, there was a training module and it was about writing standards for making toast. I don't know if other people remember doing that. And the truth is that AI standards aren't like standards for making toast, right? Because it involves an attitude going in, right? It has to be that you want to do the right thing. It is possible to go through the motions of a standard that says you must have a policy on this and a policy on that and create documents called policy and put everything in the list on there and say, right, done. with a little bit of the other stuff to get, yourself signed off, without really taking what they're trying to do seriously. But what they do is that for organisations that do want to take it seriously, for organisations that have the right attitude and want to do a good job, is they help. They're the prompts, right, that help you ensure that you're doing all the things you need to do to get there. So happy World Standards Day, everyone, and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Lyria. Two takeaways I think I got from that. First is stop looking at AI like it's the Terminator. It's not. But the second thing, which is, I guess, the more important point, is that bias and discrimination is inherent. And I think standards and regulations, respectively, will hopefully go a long way in solving some of those problems. Pivoting slightly away from AI now, we've got a presentation on digital health. So I'd like to invite Richard Dixon-Hughes to the stage.
Thank you, George. Thank you, everybody, for being here. My name's Richard Dixon-Hughes, and I chair the IT-014 Health Informatics Standards Committee here at Standards Australia. Now, IT-014 is the Australian Mirror Committee for ISO TC-215, the International Standards Committee, and TC-215 has published around 230 standards, or it's published more, but it's got 230 currently there, and about 60 under development. So we've got quite a lot of work on our plate at the moment in trying to keep up with all of that. About 30 Australian standards are direct adoptions of TC-215 standards at various times through the past. We did about 12 last year, so we're trying to move that way to keep ourselves in line with the international moves so that our products and services and activities are aligned internationally so that we can sell into the international markets and they can sell here. So what do we mean by health informatics? Quite simply, it's about using IT to improve human health. Health informatics standards help us ensure that health-related information is captured, recorded, exchanged in meaningful ways. It also helps to make sure that systems and processes are safe, effective and secure. So they're the main sort of things that we do in our health informatics standards. So, because we're based on IT, it's important that we just have a bit of a look at ICT standards, Information and Communication Technology Standards. And this, I don't expect you to read all this in detail, but this is kind of a map of the international ICT standards community. And of course, World Standards Day today, we're being sponsored by ISO, IEC and ITUT up the top there. And underneath them is a thing called JTC1, Joint Technical Committee 1, which is the IT committee of the ISO and the IEC. And JTC1 has about 3,500 IT standards and 500 under development, including what's in II in Subcommittee 42 at the moment. So that's kind of, it's a lot of IT, but there are an awful lot of other standards out there in the ICT world, and unlike Toast. And all these other bodies are there for various reasons, and other things. So it's a complex environment that we're trying to build on top of. And these days, it's more common to speak of digital health rather than health informatics. Health informatics is a fairly aged term. But the potential benefits of digital health were highlighted very much to us all during COVID-19 pandemic. And the thing that COVID-19 did was it swept away many of the barriers that were in place for all sorts of reasons, largely fear that something new might cost something more. But there are a lot of fear. But when COVID-19 came away, things just had to be done, and it actually highlighted many areas. And some of what I'm talking about shortly were driven by that. So let's have a little bit of, that's IT standards. In digital health, it's not much better, unfortunately. But this slide here shows the way in which the health informatics community tries to build on cross-sectoral, on the global health, feeds into the delivery of health services, digital health here in Australia. Down the bottom there, we have the Australian Digital Health Agency. It's a federal body. It took over from the National E-Health Transition Authority. after the transitions had taken place, and they kind of are the engine room for deciding what gets done. But above that, we have the committee I'm in, just below, we talked about TC-215, the IT-014 committee. Over on the left-hand side, we've got HL7 Australia, which is the Australian affiliate of an organisation called HL7. So there are many bodies involved in that. But the HL7 fire standard is called Fast Health Interoperability Resources, and its global community are now the dominant means of exchanging health information in the internet age. So the HL7 Australia on the left-hand side, along with CSIRO and the University of Melbourne, have contracts with ADA to deliver fire training in Australia and establish an Australian fire community of practice to support development and integration of HL7 in Australia. Now, why am I, as a Standards Australia person, talking about this? I'm talking about it because it's probably the most important thing in our environment, and it's important to realise that we need to work alongside other standards bodies. So at the international level, the representatives of main information, they meet approximately every month to share information through a thing called the Joint Initiative Council for Global Health Informatics Standardisation. So we've been talking here today about a shared view for a better future, and I think that was probably about getting the different types of stakeholders in the room together. In our environment, we have to get the different SDOs, Standards Development Organisations, in the room, otherwise we don't get anywhere, and we have to try and harmonise. And there are 13 on that list there. Of course, you mentioned HL7 up there. We've got the ISO committee, we've got the European SEN committee, but we have other bodies that are really important. Many of you will know IEEE. They write standards too, and they like to have them come around the world. All of our Wi-Fi here and around the place is all really IEEE stuff. And JTC1 is not a member of us, but obviously we're involved when it comes to IT standards. We look to them first. So I want to talk to you a little bit about a classic, a really important example of an initiative, a key initiative which illustrates the practical collaboration that we need to get a shared vision for a better world in digital health. And that's the International Patient Summary. Now, the IPS is a standardised basic clinical data set that any health professional caring for a person would need to know in order to deliver safe, effective care. It's information such as a person's allergies, their medications and significant health conditions. If you've got diabetes, or if you're pregnant, or if if you're taking blood pressure medication, that type of thing. Or so the IPS was actually sponsored by the EC, the European Commission, as a European standard, and they put in €1 million to get it written, so it wasn't a small contribution, to support cross-border care for EU citizens. In an emergency, a citizen's health records may be in a health system, in another country, and in a different language. But they have the right to travel throughout the EU, so this is cross-border care is an issue. And pilot studies have also shown similar needs exist in other contexts, even within a single country or health system. So the European standard then became fast-tracked as the basis for an international standard, ISO 27269. You might notice the European standard, I think, was 2019, so it's pretty quick for standards, in 2021. And with very few changes, which upset the Americans who wanted to change everything. But anyway, we're still working through that. And it's replaced the earlier European version because we want to keep everything on the same page. And a further edition is now under development. Thank you, 2:00 in the morning. The ISO standards identifies what information is required, what's optional, but not how it should be structured or represented. And that's where standards from HL7 International come in. They say in detail how to structure IPS data for interchange, either using a HL7 clinical document or HL7 Fire, which I just mentioned as the up-and-coming internet age standard for that. It also needs to represent clinical information in some sort of consistent manner. So that we then turn to SNOMEDs, the systemised nomenclature for medicine. It's known as SNOMED International runs that, and Loink Logical identifiers that come from Reagan Street Institute, which are widely used right throughout the health system information standards to represent information. There's 370,000 clinical terms in SNOMED CT, so it's, each one of them classified hierarchically and so forth, and always being maintained by SNOMED International. So we need their standard. There's a different standards body, and they actually made it freely available to do that. And then finally, we've got IHE International, who they produce what we call an IPS profile, which enables, it's kind of like a quality assurance standard, which basically says unambiguously how you might apply it in various use cases, and so that you can test, you can sit down a vendor to vendor and check that your IPS output comes as the IPS input using their profile. So they do that sort of thing in a whole lot of areas. They've got one for the IPS. So you can see that there's a whole group of standards things. So to keep that lot running together, there's an informal coordination group from those SDAs, and they meet every 1 or 2 weeks, depending on how much work they've got, just to share information on those developments and try and keep it thing. And there are moves to formalise that process. So while it was originally designed to cater for the cross-border unplanned emergency care, it's also really important. This information is exactly what you need when you go and see a new health practitioner anyway. And I can say that having my late father, helping him go to doctors for the last few years of his life. Every time you walk into the room, they want to know all those things. Saying, what medications is he on? What's his conditions? What's, neuropathy, wounds, all that type of thing. They want to know all that. And this is what this thing does. So actually it's quite useful if you walk down the street. You don't have to walk to another country. So the regulators around the Australian Digital Health Agency and other people, they're all interested in how that goes. So the health ministers in the 2021, the G7 health ministers actually endorsed it in their communique from Oxford after the G7 meetings as one of about 50 things they endorsed. But it's important. It has the underpinning of the health ministers of the world, and it's being widely adopted, and many of the health agencies, national health agencies, are doing it, including New Zealand, who are making quite a strong run at using it in New Zealand. And there's interest here by the government in Australia, or the governments in Australia are interested in it as well, but we haven't quite got there yet because New Zealand has quite a different system, but it's interesting that it's going. So it's being used in lots of contexts. As a result of that, a lot of more people want to stick their nose into how to govern it, of course, and it is a standards product, so we need to work out how we bring all those people in. The World Health Organisation, an international association of all those digital health agencies, the Global Digital Partnership for Health, intergovernmental, they're all talking, and we also need to make sure that clinicians, health consumers and software suppliers are part of that. So I now just briefly turn to a few other activities, the first one of which is the genomic. And each of these areas, we've formed an IT-014 subcommittee this year to progress the work in the area. So the first of those is genomics informatics, and it mirrors a subcommittee of TC215, the Genomics Informatics Subcommittee 1. And it's been involved with the interchange of genomics data, including phenotype data, that's kind of like the disease data, quality control of new generation sequencing, which we saw so much come into the COVID situation. And some of these standards have been considered for adoption in Australia. That's their first task, to say, well, what of all that work they've already done? And I think they've got about 12 standards in Subcommittee 1. Which of those things should we be doing here in Australia? We don't want to redo the wheel, so bring that in. And they've also very importantly, got a collaborative roadmap, and we've heard a little bit about roadmaps. I think Soraya discussed roadmaps earlier on. Starting off with a roadmap's a really good place because you've got all these different standards bodies doing different things, and it's a good idea to work out how to make those bits of the jigsaw fit together. So we're looking at that, and so our IT-014-19, if you're interested in genomics informatics, please sign up and join that. But SC1, I guess the interchange of that information is probably being handled more by other standards now. And so they're looking at some general issues which kind of cross a little bit into the legal areas, such as barriers and enables for the secondary use of genomics information. You want to use this stuff you collected for one thing for another thing. Well, hang on a minute, we've got things like privacy laws out there and all that sort of thing. The most critical piece of identification that you might have is your DNA. You probably know that if you've committed any crimes. They usually nail it pretty heavily on you. So that is, of course, genomics information. And of course, you give it all away on your genetic testing kits. And of course, now you've found they're going out and solving all the cold cases by trolling through your relatives on the DNA databases out there. So there are a few issues around that and how that applies. And of course, we collect an awful lot of that information in health and use it for health purposes. So the next area I want to just quickly mention is telehealth. And COVID-19 really increased the focus on that around the whole globe, and it also highlighted a need for further standardisation. So for over a decade, a chap called Dr. Alan Taylor from Flinders University has been leading work on a standard called ISO 13131, which is a standard on the quality planning guidelines for telehealth services. And it's now in its third edition. He's also written a book on the subject, so that's handy as well. Explain a bit more about it. And that has a high level of international acceptance. Whenever he goes to somewhere like the Gulf states and things, they actually want to use it to do this certification. Do we comply with the standard? Well, it was written as guidelines. And when you think about telehealth, it's used in a lot of different applications. 95% of them are on the telephone to your local GP. But then there's the high-end video type stuff and all that type of thing. Wound management, assessment of stroke patients, in regional areas where there aren't the specialists and all that type of thing. So there are different use cases and different levels of quality are required in different places, and it's got a very strong clinical. The one thing we don't do in health informatics is try to tell clinicians how to do their job. So we've got to try to sort of balance all that out. But what we're looking for now is what more work do we need to do in telehealth to fill that gap, and we've already had one organisation come and try and move into the area and fill that gap in a completely incompatible way by importing the Texas standard in for certification put up surprisingly by the company that does that certification. And that's gone away and died now, but that's the sort of thing in standards we deal with. And of course, one of the key things there again is a roadmap to make sure that we do things that are sensible and are required. Interesting countries that are really keen on this include countries like India, who are quite active in that committee. The news IT-014 subcommittee on AI and health. Guess what? We've got one. Oh, hang on, better go to the next slide. Yep, Peter Williams is running that, and we're just getting that going. But what we want to do in health is not reinvent the wheel. We want to use the work of the subcommittee. Oh, I thought I got rid of the W there. It should be SC42 and artificial intelligence, the ISO, the JTC1 committee there. And I do hope all that work on management systems and stuff is actually happening in conjunction with getting on. It is happening with SC42 in the room. Yes, good. We don't want an Australian standard that's different to everybody else. We can lead the world, but let's not be different to the world. Yep, good. Okay, I got good nods on that. And obviously they're working out how to do that. Now there's two dimensions to that. How do the people working on health standards, how do the health standards health informatics standards take in the work of the AI standards and make sure that we don't want to reinvent that wheel. We want to build on it. We want to use the same standard for the management systems as everybody else. And we want to say, but then also vertically, what are the risks of AI in health? Because we have specific applications of AI and those risks are specific to health. We need to get standards around that. So they're the two aspects there. And Peter Williams is involved. We've got a joint working group between Subcommittee 42 and TC215, which Peter is the co-chair of from the health informatics side. So an Australian leading that international work to try and make sure that we stay on the same page. We've also got a few other areas. Heather Grain shares the concept representation, which looks after all of the processes around health terminology. Prof. Tish Williams from Flinders and Vince McCauley ex-Telstra Health. They do work on security, safety and privacy. We have a lot of other people working on it, but they've actually got leadership roles on international projects. We've got Australian experts working on the pseudonymisation. That's how you mangle up data, real-life data, and then use it in clinical trials or to produce new drugs. And so, but then something goes wrong. You know you've got a pseudonymised patient. Information, they need to get back to this person to tell them to stop taking the drug because it'll kill them. They need to sometimes be able to recombine that data. So there are standards around how do you do that. And of course we've got artificial intelligence out there, which is very good at reconstructing data. So we're actually having to now, if we're going to try and hide people's identity in the use of data for secondary uses, we have to be now able to do it in a way that artificial intelligence can't put it back together and use it maliciously if that's the intent. So they're really quite complex issues. And of course, sex and gender in health records is another area. There's been quite a bit of work going on to try and pick up a more inclusive view of that world. So finally, go to government level. I don't want to go into all the details of what's happening in Australia, but action to better connect Australia's health is driven through a national digital health strategy, which is initiated by the federal government. It's backed by the states, territories and stakeholder groups, and it has many facets. But having the right standards to support secure, trusted, seamless, timely and meaningful exchange of information is the cornerstone of that strategy, or one of the cornerstones. I mean, involvement of clinical communities, another one, for example. Significant levels of funding have been allocated to that. I mean, that training I talked about earlier was more than $1 million. I won't go into, that's the sort of money we're talking about for 1 year's worth of training to people, how to get people on the same page. And the aim is to benefit us all and improve the efficiency of health care delivery. So at IT-014, we look forward to collaborating and playing our part in achieving this shared vision. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Very topical, I think, especially considering World Standards Day this year is all about health and wellbeing, and amazing to see how many international organisations, standards organisations from different jurisdictions are involved in the development of these international standards. Last but not least, I'd like to invite Frank Zeichner to the stage. We're going to hear about Internet of Things. Thanks, Frank.
Thank you, George. I'm very pleased to be here. I did get a really good takeaway, though, from Richard's slides, thank you, that there was a standards group called OMG. I thought that was interesting. Yeah, no, and it does a good function. It's about exchanging data between government and citizens. But OMG, really. There's a lot of standards out there. And I'm not going to tell you all about the standards that we're doing in Internet of Things, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about the Internet of Things and what it means and what it could mean for standards. Firstly, for those who don't know, the Internet of Things is actually a system of technologies. It includes AI in it. It's about data collection, it's about data management, it's about analysis and about actuation. So it's an end-to-end system, and in reality, those stacks of things that you do happen often many times before you get to the end customer or to the end purpose. So Internet of Things, unbelievably transformational possibilities, and in fact it's doing it now. But the Internet of Things Alliance, that I'm the chair of, Industry Association, we look at it in a slightly different way. It's not just about the technology, but it's actually way more about the purpose and the effect. And so we like to think about the Internet of Things technology we like to think of it in terms of data smartness. And data smartness is the thing that underpins and will underpin everything we do in the future. Because we're in a constrained planet, we're with constrained resources, material, biodiversity, etc. And as we move to these new models, including the circular economy, we're going to need to know what's happening, because we're doing things without knowing. We're in old business models today, grandfathering away until we run into a roadblock, and then work out how we transition. And net zero is a classic case. Here we are now hitting an existential moment where we now need to know how much carbon we're creating. And we need to know it in a granular way so that we can transition. We don't need to know it in a general way or this is our goal way. We have targets. So when I think about the Internet of Things, I think about how are we data smart about everything that we do. And that adds, so it's a tremendous opportunity, but it also adds tremendous vulnerability at the same time, where the Internet of Things, this data smartness will become utterly pervasive in that semi-Terminator way. So we need to be able to manage that journey so that we can manage what we're doing with the data, for what purpose, with whom we're sharing it, at what level of data, only the data we need, and only hold it as long as we need it. Now, we don't have a DNA to do that right now. We're still in driving the car wherever it can go mode and not quite sure what the guardrails are because anything's possible, right? You've got the data, come up with a new idea, ripper. So the guardrails aren't there. They're not there for how we use the data and the technology. And I love what you were saying, Lyria, about AI, because for me, it's a technology. It's not a purpose. It's not an effect. It relies on the data. You don't have good data, you get a crap GPT output. End of story. You constrain the environment within which you put the AI, good outcome, if you designed it that way. So plenty of opportunity and need for having guardrails and standards for how we do that. Now, we're involved in, I probably don't even remember all the names, we're involved in the IoT and digital twin standards groups. We're one of the 300 nominating organisations. We're in the smart cities one, we're in smart manufacturing, we're in simulation. There's a whole lot of areas that all impinge and go sideways and up and down. And it's a bit of a ziggurat, a complicated network that we need to go through. So standards are utterly vital. Without it, we're not going to get there. But I really reckon, and Richard gave us a fantastic example of, we really need to know, we need to have a lot of smart people and smart ways of navigating through what they mean and when they're important and when they're not important. And I think that they're a tool for enabling us to understand what's relevant and important in what context, but the narrative around it needs tremendous amounts of work. So Standards Australia is the foundation organisation for the fuel, but we sure as heck need to be the interpreters of how we apply it. So I think, and how it applies to law is one, how it applies to behaviour, in my mind, matters a lot. And so when I talk about the trust, and we heard trust, for me, as IoT and the data about everything we do, like everything we go, everything we use, how often we use it, whether we've recycled it or not, whether we're in that place for too long or not long enough, or whether we're short, tall, whatever, that's going to be around somewhere. That might be completely fine if it's with the people we want trust to use it. So the standards, but moreover the behaviour and the social capital that comes along with knowing what trust is what we need to be working on. And so for me, IoT trust is about 10 things in there. And it's about, is it secure? Is it private? Is it fair? What is the provenance of the data? Has it changed along the way? And indeed, the data always changes along the way. We're filtering it, we're sending it to this person and that person, and by the time we get to the end customer or the deliverer, it's gone through 5 hands or 10 hands. Are they all trusted along the journey? Is it authentic? Is the person that it came from the one you knew it came from? And so these are all aspects that need standards, but behaviour and understanding. And so I completely agree with Lyria that we got to be really careful about putting laws out there for AI, but we really need to understand what AI means. I mean, what its application means. And I don't mean the developers. I mean the people who are the users, the product sellers. That's another complete way of looking at it. So the standards that are not that are informative are really valuable. I mean, the ones that are prescriptive, that are normative, that tell you exactly how to do it, that's for the developers, fine. But the ones that tell us what it means and how it applies, they are fundamental to us. So on World Standards Days, I call for the standards organisations to lift their game in information and explanation and narrative and roadmap. For me, that's where we can really have good effect, maybe even affect legislators and policymakers, which is tough. And in a world that's changing faster than we have ever gone in terms of adopting new technologies, and that slide that I saw up there, which is move fast and break it, which is interesting. We're breaking it. So we have to move fast. And I wanted to sort of just go to the thing that I think matters the most right now, apart from trust. It's back to this net zero thing. And we really need to have the data to inform transition, but we need to have the standards and the trust to be able to share that information. We need the data models. We need the trusted custodians and what that means, what a standard for a trusted data custodian means. And that basically means we have to develop data commons that drive sectoral strategies, that define how we share the data over for carbon border adjustment mechanisms, for how we meet all those obligations. That is a lot of work. Today, the climate-related financial disclosures that are going to come out there, and they're going to descend on the top 30,000 companies in Australia, will provide only qualitative data. So what the heck does that mean, and how will it drive behaviour? It won't. We need data in there, and we need to rush really fast to get it at a granular enough level so that we get past averaging and we start identifying real plans and real transition and real adaptation. We need data, we need AI, we need standards, but we need understanding for it to work. And that is my presentation. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Frank. I think a really important point you touched on there regarding net zero and our transition to net zero and trusting the data to get us to net zero is absolutely important. So I'd now like to invite all four presenters back to join the panel. The EU's proposed AI Act, and there has been quite some hype on the AI Act, and I think there's been that question of, is this just regulation that you can Control-C, Control-V to another country or another jurisdiction? Should Australia take a similar approach to the approach the EU is taking?
No, I would argue. I still think that define then regulate is not the best way for government to deal with rapidly moving, vaguely defined technologies like artificial intelligence. I would still say from a law perspective, what we need government to do is set the rules around values that we already know we want to protect. So things like discrimination, right? Like, let's fix that act. We don't need a concept of AI defined and then regulated. Part of the problem with the EU's approach is that essentially they're only regulating things when it fits into that box of how they've defined AI, which they haven't quite decided how to do yet either. So it means, for example, that subliminal advertising is only prohibited if done with an AI system. It's that kind of thing. What will happen is organisations that want to work around that law will work around the definition rather than complying with what the EU wants, which is what everybody wants, safe and responsible AI.
Great, thank you. And actually sticking to, I guess, on the topic of regulation, Frank, earlier this year, the Biden administration launched its IoT cybersecurity labelling program. I guess in a nutshell, how beneficial will such a program be? And then secondly, is there scope for there to be a similar type of program rolled out here in Australia?
Thanks, George. Look, it's a really important initiative. It follows the UK mandating consumer IoT security from April next year. I mean, it'll be in law from then. So, does it matter? Oh yeah, it sure does matter. We have an ocean of IoT devices going out to consumers today. An ocean, and within that ocean, there are a lot of very insecure devices and very insecure processes for delivering them, including the cameras that go in your home. Dare I say it, even the cameras that go into prisons, although that's not going to be covered by this, unfortunately. And so we need to weed out those bad actors, but moreover, we need the customers who buy these devices to know which ones are actually meeting a minimum standard. I think we're at the point where we need to decide that we have to have lines on the road, and that is a line on the road, really. And so without that, we're not going to get rid of it. We know ACMA identifies 60,000 botted devices a day that we should be doing something about, but we don't. There are codes of conduct for dealing with it that aren't happening, that aren't being used. So we need ways of consumers to start being able to decide, and labelling is key for that. Unless you start getting consumers to say, I'm not buying that, you're not going to get, the bad guys are just going to keep sending out that cheap stuff, and we need to get rid of it.
Yeah, really, that's a really interesting point. And on that, talking about the sort of devices, what's being rolled out now, I think one thing we've touched on, and I guess has been a theme throughout all four presentations, is that technology is actually evolving at a rate we haven't previously seen. Soraya, maybe to look at some of the work Standards Australia is doing, how is Standards Australia ensuring that its solutions are meeting the needs of society as we move forward?
It's a great question. Ultimately, the standards we're developing, and I guess Lyria touched on this in a bit of depth, and so did Frank actually, they're largely about the ethics and the way the technology is being used. So it's less about the technical detail of what is in the black box, but if you want to govern yourself ethically, and if you want to be responsible, using those types of standards which are sector agnostic, which are horizontal, which can help support that position and help support that good intention, is really where the standards work in technology is happening at the moment. We're obviously always looking at new technologies. We've got something called the alternate pathway for standards development, which is an expedited pathway. Standards development can be a long process. So we're trying to find ways to kind of speed that process up in a way that's really applicable for the pace of technology, but also allows the technology to mature enough to put appropriate guardrails in. It's a delicate balance. So we're doing something with the alternative pathway at the moment with the metaverse, and using that as, I guess, a pilot to see how it works. But generally speaking, a lot of the way we are using standards is largely for technologies which, like AI, have been around for decades. We have seen the level of maturity, and actually they're more about the holistic approach than the how do you govern your black box.
Yeah, really interesting. Richard, looking at the standards landscape vis-a-vis digital health, what do you see as being the biggest challenge in digital health going forward, perhaps in the next decade? A little broad, sorry.
Short answer.
The short answer is people. We can write, there's quite a degree of complexity in all of the stuff that I present, and I apologise for that. But for people the idea about standards is you're getting people on the same page, but just reading a dry as dust document doesn't get you there. And so what we're learning, and also the world is changing as we're moving along. So people who study standardisation in the health sector particularly are realising that it's all part of an ecosystem, and you have to actually have a community. And the community needs to be informing itself and growing. and there's a feedback cycle. People come together, they produce the standard, then it's got to be applied in a controlled way, and often you see these government agencies, everything else mandating it. But if you're going to have interoperability, you're going to share information, you've got to do that in a consistent way. So people got to be talking as they implement. Then we're going to learn that the standard really wasn't that good and a few new things come along and we've got to change it and things. And so we've got to move that through the cycle, and that's got to be owned by a community of interest. And I think that's one of the things that that fire standard was invented about 12 years ago by an Australian called Graham Grieve in Melbourne. He took 3 months off. He was probably our foremost expert in HL7 standards in the world, and he took 3 months off and said, this isn't working, this isn't the way Google does it, this isn't the way Facebook does it. There needs to be an internet savvy type of way of doing it. And HL7 had got itself in a hell of a whole thing called V3. He just sat down and he sketched out what it was. But the key thing he has found is now he is the sort of project leader for that around the world. The very thing that came out of that was the community. So you might have noticed there I mentioned something, the Australian Fire Community Process. So the government's actually investing in the community. You go to use that, there's a training course that runs for a better part of a week now that's part of that $1.5 million worth to get our developers on the same page. But it's also the clinicians that you've got to get involved. You've got your business processes that surround that. And we know that, when you look at the digital hospital and all that type of thing, the successes and the failure, it's how you trained, equipped, skilled your people and how they interacted with the technology environment is the critical success factor, and that's not an easy one.
No, agreed. Thank you, Richard. Shifting the conversation back to regulation, Lyria, we've seen the New South Wales AI assurance framework, and there's been quite a bit of talk around the framework and I guess its applications. Do you see there being the worry that the states and territories in Australia are going to go about AI in their own way? And if so, in your opinion, what's the best way at actually having a nationally harmonised approach to AI?
So I think that, I'd say that the ideal and certainly the point of Standards Australia working through organisations like ISO, IEC and so forth is that we actually end up even better than that with sort of international sort of frameworks. I think that maybe if I put it this way, if everyone there was a lovely diagram with digital health and all the different organisations. If everyone comes up with their own standards and those don't interrelate well, so it's possible to have local versions of things that sort of sit within international sort of frameworks and terminology. But if everyone goes ahead on any area, AI is just one, and create sort of completely separate things that don't talk to each other, in a sense that's fine up to a point, right? So if the New South Wales AI assurance framework is directed at New South Wales government, they can all do that fine. The challenge comes when you're then seeking external services and you're saying to that external service provider, oh, you have to comply with these ones that we have. And the external service provider also has to comply with whatever Victoria might, et cetera, et cetera. Hopefully, at least in Australia, we'll get a national one modelled on New South Wales rather than separate states. But in a worst case scenario, that's what it can look like. And then, of course, they have to do it for other jurisdictions. And then whoever else, other organisations that say, well, this is our little version of it, and they have to do it for that. And if you're looking to have, a service that you're providing at an international level, which is where you get a lot of the efficiencies of scale, a lot of the really interesting innovation is happening, it increases compliance costs without necessarily getting a benefit, right? Because a lot of the time, these frameworks aren't saying different things. They're saying the same things in different ways, which means from a compliance perspective, you have to prove that you're doing it this way and that way and that way. So that's the kind of worst case scenario. It doesn't necessarily happen. And as I said, it's certainly possible for these things to talk to each other in enough ways or for frameworks to work with reference to each other. So for example, it's possible for a state to say that we recognise this as meeting our requirements or that, and organisations can then, as long as both sets of standards are good. So there are ways of making it work, but it definitely is something I think that needs to be, the assurance framework is very valuable, but we just need to keep an eye on how does it coordinate with other things as they're being developed.
Yes, great. Thank you, Lyria. Fascinating insight there. Do we have any questions in the room? I'm looking at Slido. I don't think there's anything. Slido, there is a gentleman here. So if we can get just a microphone. Thank you.
Meu nome é Raffaele D'Angelo, founder and director of RDA Consultancy. Thanks for the presentation, really good. Appreciate it. I'm just coming back into standards. I was around in the days of risk management OB007 from 4360 to ISO, so appreciate the discussion. And AI is a really interesting topic at the moment because I deal with boards and there's a real disconnect at the moment. They're considering privacy, data, information, and all they're interested in is how am I protecting, how is it working within the organisation. The executives aren't really sure about what they're doing. A lot of systems are happening, a lot of things are being done. The people who are actually doing the work, it's either contracted out to people who are subcontractors. I guess what I'm proposing is that there's opportunities there for standards to do a lot more and to actually educate boards, executives and management. So I think there's an opportunity there for everybody here to actually take that on board. The other thing is AI. We're talking about AI. We're already moving into AGI, artificial general intelligence. So we're talking about machines who actually think like me and act like me. So whilst we're dealing with AI, we're still a little bit behind the eight ball. So there's things that are going on. So I'd like to get perspectives from each one of you and see whether there is a different world that we're approaching. You were asked for 10 years down the track. I think I'm predicting that Skynet is still possible.
I can give a perspective perhaps. What's actually happening is the tools that we use, the data we're collecting and the rate at which we're processing is increasing at a dramatic rate. So that's absolutely happening. What that's simply doing is saying that it makes decision making scale really fast. And it's frankly it puts more and more emphasis on what decisions are you making. And people pretty much haven't placed much emphasis on the decisions they're making because they're local. And if they make a mistake, it doesn't matter. But when you start AIing it and start using data of everybody, the effect is massive. So it's way more about what are you doing and why you're doing it and how you're making decisions. And by the way, now that you're using this tool, that means it affects 1 million people, not 20. Will that change what I might be deciding? And should I be testing more the effect, i.e. robo-debt? And so that the tool is simply a massive, it's like throwing petrol on the fire, right? It makes the fire better, but do you want the fire that big? So that's the question. So it's managing the tool better doesn't help you. It's managing the decisions and the purpose and the effect better is obviously the key. That's always been the case with technology. I think that's certainly my view. It's fantastically powerful, but bloody dangerous.
I'll try to be. I'd probably there in some countries in the world that have ageing populations, they're looking very much to AI to try and fill the gap, to provide the interpersonal care when they can't find people to do the job, and that's obviously a tricky one. But in the other parts of the world where we're just looking at the conventional healthcare, we're moving away. At the moment, we're still in a situation where healthcare is delivered in a paradigm which is you go to an institution and you're a product. You're a ruptured quad tendon in my case, and you're processed through the thing. It's not Richard Dixon-Hughes. It's ruptured quad tendon on Tuesday, and then you get pumped from the operating theatre to the recovery, and then you end up in OT and physio. You're a product. And we're moving away from that to actually treating the whole of the person in their environment intelligently, taking on board that each of us has a different genomic susceptibility diseases. We're all exposed to different bugs out there with different genomic sequences in our environment and everything else, and we've got a different cultural makeup and whatnot. And AI can actually help us in that, and we're trying to do that rather than just replace the doctors, which we probably can't do. They won't let us. But we do have to. We definitely see some opportunities in that, but there's also all those risks which we're all trying to talk about. So it's a little bit blue sky still at the moment for health. Health's a very complex system that's evolved through human interaction. The relationship between the various different health professions have grown up from the battlefields of Crimea all the way through to our modern, tertiary hospital system. people train for years to fit into that system, so it's quite complex.
Yeah, I always stay away from predicting the future. I find it very hard. But what I do think is that we need institutions that work when we can't. In other words, we actually don't know everything that's going to happen in AI. If you'd asked me 2 years ago would I have predicted where generative AI is now and said that's the next big thing, no, I wouldn't have, just being honest. So we can't predict exactly what's going to happen. What we can do is ensure that we have structures. Government should be thinking about what structures it can put in place, but standards body should be thinking about all of the things that we discussed earlier about, fast tracking, how do we prioritise resources to be able to standardise a rapidly evolving technology in directions we can't predict.
Yeah, look, I'll take a slightly different take in terms of what you said. I think the education and implementation piece is really crucial, and there's a moment that we're at which is posing an existential threat to board directors and leaders and senior executives where they need to make decisions about what and how they use these tools for their company and do so with support that gives people confidence. And you're absolutely right that there is work to be done in terms of we can build the standards and we can develop the standards to the absolute best degree possible. We need to learn how to make that leap from here is the document to here it is in action in many more organisations, and it's something that we're all proactively working on.
Thank you. Unfortunately, I think that's all we have time for today. What a fantastic discussion. I think I share the optimism and enthusiasm in the room that there's a genuine excitement about technology, not the sense of trepidation that might be reflected in some parts of the media. But I think we've also highlighted today the important value of standards, and standards really being that piece of the puzzle to ensure that we develop technology in a safe and responsible way going forward. So another massive thank you to our panel today. Can we please give them another round of applause? I think I can say, like everyone, I think we can all leave having learnt something new today, which is obviously great. But before we wrap up, a big shout out to my colleagues at Standards Australia, the internal comms and events teams, for all your efforts in, organising this event and making sure it ran smoothly on the day. And thank you to the production team who's joined us also today. Thank you to all of you who have attended. For those online, have a great remainder of the day. For those here in person, we would love you to stick around and continue the conversation over some refreshments outside. So on behalf of Standards Australia, happy World Standards Day, and thank you for your participation today.